friends, this is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we're going to talk about the problem of subjectivity in the measure of contract damages. If you are in my class, this corresponds to Units 9 and 10. We're going to talk about two things. Number one, from whose perspective should we be measuring contract damages, the breachers or the non-breachers? And number two, how do we actually do the counting in cases where it may not be immediately obvious how we should count? If you think about it for a minute, for the most part, the problems we've looked at to this point have involved what we might think of as fairly objective measures of damages, the price of apples in a contract or the market price, where we're not sure quite what to do for the non-breacher. By contrast, there are some cases where there won't be readily available information about price or value, and that will be because, or could be because, the value is subjective. It's not out there in the world, as would be the case in an objective measure, but instead it's really in the head of one of the parties, for example, pain and suffering, which we talk about in connection with a couple of the cases that we do. We look at two types of cases in this context. First, construction-related cases such as PV House. Second, problems involving contracts involving medical services such as Hawkins and Sullivan. So first, whose expectations are we thinking about? As you can imagine, ordinarily courts like to look to the world from the perspective of the non-breacher. So restatement of contract section section 347 says the injured party has a right to damages based on his or her expectation, interest as measured by the loss in value to him or her of the other party's performance caused by its failure. Sounds like, we look at the world from the aggrieved party's perspective. On the other hand, restatement second of contract section 351 says that damages are not recoverable for loss that the party in breach, the breacher, did not have reason to foresee as a probable result of the breach when the contract was made. This, of course, I think derives from Hadley. You see it continue through to the consequential damages measure under 2715. How have courts handled this? Well, take a look at cases like PV House, right? It looks like the court's viewing the world from the perspective of the breacher, not the non-breacher. Why? Well, it announces what we can call a cost of performance rule. Says that if the cost of performance, a remedy under the contract, is grossly disproportionate to the value that would result, the court will only award the value that would result, not the cost of performance. That's obviously what the breacher in that case wanted, and so I think it's not unreasonable to think that that's the perspective the Supreme Court of Oklahoma took in PV House. On the other hand, you have a case like Hawkins, where the court in New Hampshire in a medical services case sort of took the perspective of the non-breacher, young George Hawkins, whose hand was not, in fact, repaired as promised by Dr. Sullivan. The court, I think, is trying to be careful and says, well, we're not going to award George damages for pain and suffering. Those might be too idiosyncratic, but we will view the world from his perspective. What would the value of a perfect hand have been? And then you have a case like Sullivan, where the court seems a little ambivalent about whose perspective really counts. On one hand, it says that the non-breacher's perspective might be problematic because it might lead courts or juries to award damages that are too speculative or too high. On the other hand, there isn't much else to go on in cases, again, involving medical services, because the cost of the doctor services is often going to be significantly different from the value, ultimately, of the services rendered. So that's perspective, probably the non-breachers, but not necessarily. Second, how do we measure? And here, again, you see three somewhat different approaches. As we said, PV House announces a cost of performance rule, and you can think of this as being a fairly objective approach. The court, in choosing the value of performance rather than the cost of performance, I think is saying that the PV Houses placed, a great deal of value in their farm, but it was subjective to them. It was idiosyncratic to them, and we can't really figure out what that is, and so we're not, and in any case we think it's too much, and so we're going to stick with what we think is a more objective approach, the value. Similarly, I think Hawkins also takes an objective approach. Its pain and suffering rule says that, George, you don't get damages for pain and suffering, there the court characterizes that as being George's contribution to the joint effort, and almost a kind of reliance damage. And we know that you can't get both reliance and expectation. He gets expectation. He gets the difference between the hand he was promised and the hand he got. And then you have a case like Sullivan, where the court says, well, okay, it's true that you're not supposed to get pain and suffering in expectation, too subjective, too idiosyncratic, unless you didn't expect to suffer. There, I think the court is, in a weird way, it's easier for the court to come to that conclusion because Ms. Sullivan, the plaintiff, was promised a better nose in 2 surgeries. She had to have a 3rd surgery because the first 2 didn't work. That was painful. That 3rd one was painful. She saw pain and suffering for that. Court said, well, we could award that either in reliance, as I think the Hawkins court had hinted, or in expectation, which I think students understandably find a little confusing. All of this leaves a few questions to think about. First, are these rules that were announced by these courts, cost of performance, pain and suffering, so on, are they just limited to their particular types of contracts, or can they be analogized to others? If they can be analogized to others, how far do we go? Second, why don't we give credit for subjective damages in contracts, generally speaking? Why are we uncomfortable with them? Torts, we seem to be okay with it. Pain and suffering, for example. Contracts are different. Why? Third, is contract doctrine a very effective way of dealing with these problems at all? As you can imagine, especially with respect to medical services, the way the legal system typically deals with these things is through torts, not through contracts. This is an example of, I think, contract law and tort law bumping into each other. We suggested at the beginning of the semester that you might see some examples of this, in this course, and this is one of those examples. And so it's worth thinking about, well, is this really what contract doctrine is capable of doing? And, if not, what else? If so, how can we make it work in a way that we're comfortable with? That is the real deal on the problem of subjectivity in contract damages. We'll talk more about this in class. Until then.